The town of Redemption sat in a shallow valley where the dust never quite settled and the sun burned white against a sky that stretched forever. It wasn't much. A handful of buildings along a single dirt road, a saloon that doubled as the general store, a livery stable with a leaning roof, and a church with a bell that hadn't rung in years. James Coulter rode into town just after noon, his horse tired and his canteen nearly empty. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for anything, really, just a place to water his horse, buy supplies, and keep moving. He'd been moving for 3 years now. The street was quiet. A few people moved between the buildings, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. No one looked at him directly. In towns like this, strangers were either ignored or watched carefully, and James preferred the former. He dismounted outside the livery and led his horse inside. The stable master was an old man with bent shoulders and cloudy eyes. He took the reins without a word, nodded at the coin James offered, and disappeared into the shadows at the back of the barn. James stepped back into the sunlight and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made every breath feel heavy. He crossed the street toward the general store, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. That's when he saw her. She was standing outside the store, one hand braced against the wooden post that held up the awning, the other pressed against her swollen belly. Her dress was faded blue, dusty and worn, and her face was pale, too pale for the heat of the day. She was heavily pregnant, 9 months, maybe more. James slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. Something was wrong. The woman's knees buckled slightly, and she gripped the post harder, her knuckles white. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. James stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am." She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, staring at something he couldn't see. "Ma'am," he said again, louder this time. Her gaze flickered toward him, but she didn't speak. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were trying to form words but couldn't find them. James took a step closer. "You all right?" Her hands slipped from the post. And then she collapsed. James lunged forward, his arms outstretched, catching her just before she hit the ground. Her weight sagged against him, dead and heavy, her head lolling back. He dropped to one knee, cradling her carefully, his heart pounding. "Someone get a doctor," he shouted, his voice sharp and urgent. A few people turned to look, but no one moved. They stood frozen, staring, their faces blank, with the kind of indifference that comes from seeing too much hardship and learning not to care. James's jaw tightened. He looked down at the woman in his arms. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her dress was soaked with sweat, and beneath his hand he could feel her belly tightening, hard, rigid, wrong. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, "can you hear me?" She didn't respond. And then he felt it, a movement beneath his hand, sharp and sudden, followed by a rush of warmth. His eyes widened. The baby was coming. "Christ," he muttered under his breath. He looked around desperately. "Is there a doctor in this town? A midwife? Anyone?" A woman stepped forward from the crowd, middle-aged, with a worn apron and cautious eyes. "Doc S been gone 2 weeks, rode out to Silver Creek and hasn't come back." James stared at her. "What about a midwife?" The woman shook her head. "Closest one's half a day's ride from here." James's mind raced. The woman in his arms groaned softly, her face twisting in pain. Her belly contracted again, harder this time, and she cried out, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the afternoon heat like a knife. "She's having the baby now," James said, his voice tight. "Where can I take her?" The woman in the apron hesitated, glancing at the others. No one spoke. James's voice turned cold. "Where?" Finally, a man stepped forward, tall, thin, with a nervous face. "There's a room above the store. It's not much, but—" "Show me," James said. The man nodded quickly and led the way. James lifted the pregnant woman carefully, cradling her against his chest, and followed him into the store. The interior was dim and cluttered, filled with barrels of flour and sacks of grain. A narrow staircase led up to the second floor. James climbed carefully, each step measured, the woman's labored breathing loud in his ears. At the top of the stairs was a small room, bare except for a cot, a washstand, and a single window that let in a shaft of dusty light. He laid her down on the cot as gently as he could. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James crouched beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. "I will, I promise." Her hand reached out and gripped his wrist, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Please." He nodded, swallowing hard. "What's your name?" "Anna," she gasped. "Anna Lawson." "All right, Anna," James said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I'm going to help you, but you have to stay with me, you understand?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. James turned to the man who'd led them upstairs. "I need water, clean rags, and a knife, something sharp." The man's face went white. You know what you're doing." "No," James said flatly, "but she doesn't have a choice. Now go." The man fled. James turned back to Anna. Her body convulsed again, another contraction tearing through her. She screamed, her back arching off the cot. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and calm. "Breathe, Anna, just breathe." She looked at him, her eyes wild with fear and pain. I can't do this." "You can," he said firmly. "You will." The man returned with water, rags, and a small paring knife. James took them without a word and set them on the washstand. He rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands quickly, scrubbing the dust and grime away. Anna's breathing grew more frantic. Her hands clutched at the thin blanket beneath her. James knelt at the foot of the cot and looked up at her. "Anna, listen to me. When the next contraction comes, you're going to push. Hard as you can, you understand?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Good," James said. "I've got you." The contraction came, and Anna screamed. The baby came fast and hard, as if it had been waiting too long and couldn't hold on any longer. James had delivered foals before, calves once or twice, but never a child. His hands shook as he guided the infant into the world, catching the tiny, slick body before it could slip from his grasp. For a terrible, breathless moment, the baby didn't cry. James's heart stopped. Then the infant's chest heaved, and a wail tore through the room, sharp, furious, alive. Relief flooded through him so suddenly he almost staggered. He wrapped the baby in one of the clean rags, his hands clumsy but careful, and lifted the child toward Anna. "It's a girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have a daughter." Anna's eyes were closed. Her face was deathly pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. She didn't respond. "Anna," James said, louder this time. "Anna, can you hear me?" "Nothing." He laid the baby gently on the cot beside her mother and pressed his fingers to Anna's throat, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, thready, but there. She was alive. Barely. James stood quickly and moved to the door, shouting down the stairs. "I need help up here, now." The woman in the apron appeared moments later, her face pale and anxious. She took one look at Anna and the baby and crossed herself. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "She's lost a lot of blood," James said, his voice tight. "I need bandages, more water, and someone who knows what the hell they're doing." The woman nodded and disappeared back down the stairs. James returned to Anna's side, pressing rags against the bleeding, doing everything he could think of to stop it. The baby cried beside him, high and insistent, her tiny fists curled against her chest. James glanced at the infant, then back at Anna. Her breathing was growing weaker. "Come on," he muttered. "Stay with me." The woman returned with more supplies, and together they worked to stabilize Anna. They cleaned her, packed the wounds, elevated her legs. James had no idea if he was doing the right things, but he did them anyway because doing nothing felt like surrendering. An hour passed, then two. Finally, Anna's breathing steadied. Her pulse grew stronger. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and she looked at James with a gaze so full of exhaustion and gratitude that he had to look away. "Your daughter's fine," he said quietly. "She's right here." Anna's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes closed again, and she drifted back into unconscious sleep. The woman in the apron lifted the baby carefully and began cleaning her with gentle hands. "What about you?" she asked, glancing at James. "You planning to stay?" James looked down at his hands, covered in blood, shaking slightly. "I don't know." The woman's expression softened. "You saved them both. That's not a small thing." James didn't respond. He moved to the window and stared out at the street below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dust. People moved about their business as if nothing had happened. He thought about leaving, saddling his horse and riding out before anyone could ask questions or expect more from him than he was willing to give. But when he looked back at the cot, at Anna, pale and still, and the baby wrapped in a rag beside her, he found he couldn't move. The woman in the apron stood. "I'll sit with her tonight. You should rest." "I'm fine," James said. "You're not," the woman replied. "Gently, but I understand." She left quietly, closing the door behind her. James pulled a chair over to the cot and sat down. He watched Anna breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest. The baby slept fitfully, her tiny face scrunched in dreams James couldn't imagine. He didn't know this woman, he didn't owe her anything. But he'd caught her when she fell, he'd brought her daughter into the world. And now, whether he liked it or not, they were his responsibility. The next morning, Anna woke. James was still sitting in the chair, his head tipped back against the wall, eyes half closed. He heard her stir and sat up immediately. "Easy," he said. "Don't move too fast." Anna blinked slowly, her gaze moving around the room until it landed on the baby sleeping beside her. Her eyes filled with tears. She's alive," Anna whispered. "She is," James said, "and so are you." Anna reached out a trembling hand and touched the baby's cheek. A sob escaped her throat, relief and grief tangled together in a sound that made James's chest tighten. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at him. "Thank you." James nodded once. "You need water and food if you can keep it down." He stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water into a tin cup. He brought it to her and helped her sit up enough to drink. She sipped slowly, her hands shaking. "What's your name?" she asked after a moment. "James." "James," she repeated softly. "I'm Anna." "I know." She looked down at the baby. I don't have anyone. My husband, he's gone, died 6 months ago." James said nothing. "I was trying to get to my sister S," Anna continued, her voice thin and fragile, "in Santa Fe, but I ran out of money. I thought I could make it a little farther before the baby came." James crouched beside the cot. "You almost didn't make it at all." Anna's eyes welled up again. "I know." "You need rest," James said, "and when you're strong enough, we'll figure out what comes next." Anna asked, surprised. James's jaw tightened. He hadn't meant to say that. But it was too late now. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we." Anna stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." James looked away, toward the window. "Doesn't matter." "It does." He was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. "I had a family once," he said, his voice low. "Wife, son, fever took them both 3 years ago." He paused. "I've been running ever since, running from everything." Anna's expression softened. "Maybe I'm tired of running," James said, "or maybe I just don't want to see anyone else fall." Anna reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you, James." He nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the sun climbed higher into the sky. And in that small, dusty room above a forgotten store, 2 broken people and a newborn child began to breathe together. 3 days passed, and Anna grew stronger. The woman in the apron, Her name was Margaret, brought food and helped care for the baby. The town, for the most part, remained indifferent. A few people stopped by to gawk, but no one offered help beyond polite nods and murmured blessings. James stayed. He slept on the floor beside the cot, waking at every sound the baby made. He fetched water, changed rags, and sat quietly while Anna nursed her daughter. He didn't talk much, and Anna didn't press him. They existed in a fragile silence, held together by necessity and something neither of them could name. On the fourth morning, trouble arrived. James was downstairs in the store buying supplies when the door swung open hard enough to rattle the hinges. 3 men walked in, rough-looking, with hard eyes and dust-caked clothes, the kind of men who carried violence in their posture. The tallest one, a man with a scarred face and a black hat, scanned the room until his eyes landed on James. "You the one who helped the woman upstairs?" the man asked, his voice flat and cold. James straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, though he carried no gun. "What's it to you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Name's Keller, that woman upstairs, Anna Lawson, she owes money." James's jaw tightened. "To who?" "To me." Keller stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Her husband borrowed $100 last year, never paid it back. Then he up and died, leaving me with nothing." "That's got nothing to do with her," James said evenly. "Debt doesn't die with the debtor," Keller said. "She inherits it, and I intend to collect." James's eyes darkened. "She just had a baby, she's got nothing." Keller shrugged. "Not my problem." One of the other men, a wiry, mean-looking fellow with a scar across his cheek, grinned. "Maybe the baby's worth something." James's blood went cold. "You say that again, and I'll break your jaw." The room fell silent. Keller's smile faded. "You threatening me?" "I'm stating a fact," James said quietly. Keller stewed at him for a long moment, then laughed, low and humorless. "You got guts, I'll give you that, but guts don't pay debts." "She doesn't have the money," James said, "and even if she did, I wouldn't let you take it." Keller's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you to stop me?" "Someone who's not going to let you hurt a woman and a newborn child." Keller's hand moved toward the gun on his hip. James didn't flinch. Margaret appeared from the back room, her face pale but her voice steady. "Keller, you take one step toward those stairs, and I'll make sure every person in this town knows what kind of man you are." Keller turned his gaze on her, his expression contemptuous. "You think I care what this town thinks?" "I think you care about doing business here," Margaret said, "and I think you know no one will trade with a man who threatens new mothers." Keller's jaw tightened. He looked back at James, then at Margaret, weighing his options. Finally, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "I'll give her a week, then I'm coming back for what's owed." He turned and walked out, his men following. The door slammed shut behind them. James exhaled slowly, his hands still clenched into fists. Margaret looked at him, her face grim. "He means it, he'll be back." "I know," James said. "What are you going to do?" James was silent for a moment, then turned toward the stairs. "I don't know yet." Upstairs, Anna was sitting on the edge of the cot, holding her daughter. She looked up when James entered, her face anxious. "I heard voices," she said. "Was that?" "Keller," James finished. "He says your husband owed him money." Anna's face went white. "I didn't know. Thomas never told me." "Doesn't matter," James said. "He's coming back in a week, and he's not going to leave empty-handed." Anna's hands trembled. "What do I do?" James crouched in front of her, his voice calm but firm. "You don't do anything. I'll handle it." "How?" Anna asked, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't have the money. I don't have anything." James looked at the baby in her arms, tiny, fragile, innocent. Then he looked back at Anna. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Why?" Anna whispered. "Why are you doing this?" James didn't answer right away. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at the dusty street below. "Because someone has to," he said finally. Anna watched him, her heart aching with gratitude and fear. Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly, and somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats echoed against the hard-packed earth. The clock was ticking. That evening, after the baby had been fed and Anna had fallen into an exhausted sleep, James sat alone on the floor with his back against the wall. The room was quiet, except for the soft sounds of breathing. He stared at his hands, calloused, scarred, hands that had built fences and buried loved ones. Hands that had caught a falling woman and delivered a child into the world. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't stop. A soft sound drew his attention. Anna was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him. "You should be resting," James said quietly. "So should you," Anna replied. They looked at each other for a long moment. "Can I ask you something?" Anna said. James nodded. "When you lost your family, how did you survive it?" James's throat tightened. He looked away. "I didn't, not really." Anna waited. "I just kept moving," James continued, his voice low. "Figured if I didn't stop, I wouldn't have to feel it." He paused. "Didn't work." "I'm sorry," Anna whispered. James shook his head. "You don't have anything to be sorry for." "I feel like I'm asking too much of you," Anna said. "You've already done so much, and now—" "You're not asking," James interrupted gently. "I'm choosing." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" James was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because maybe this is how I stop running." Anna reached out her hand. James hesitated, then took it. Her grip was warm and steady. "What was her name?" Anna asked softly. "Your wife." "Clara." "And your son?" "Daniel." Anna squeezed his hand. "They'd be proud of you." James's jaw clenched. He shook his head. "I don't know about that." "I do," Anna said. "You saved my life. You saved my daughter's life. That's not nothing." James looked at the baby sleeping peacefully on the cot. "What are you going to name her?" Anna smiled faintly. "I was thinking Clara." James's breath caught. He looked at Anna, his eyes glistening. "If that's all right with you," Anna added quickly. James nodded, unable to speak. Anna's smile deepened. "Thank you, James, for everything." James stood and moved to the window, composing himself. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, bright and cold, in the vast expanse of night. "We'll figure out Keller," he said after a moment. "I promise you that." "How?" Anna asked. "I don't know yet," James admitted, "but I will." Anna nodded, trusting him in a way that made his chest ache. The next morning, James went into town and asked questions. He learned that Keller ran a small operation, loaning money to desperate people at impossible rates, then collecting through intimidation and violence. The law turned a blind eye because Keller paid them off. But James also learned something else. Keller had a weakness. He was a gambler, and not a good one. James found him that afternoon in the saloon, sitting at a poker table with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a losing hand. James approached slowly, his expression calm. "Got room for one more?" James asked. Keller looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're that drifter." "I am." Keller gestured to an empty chair. "Sit, but if you're here to beg, you're wasting your time." "I'm not here to beg," James said, sitting down. "I'm here to make a deal." Keller leaned back, intrigued. "I'm listening." "I'll play you for the debt," James said. "One hand, if I win, the debt's forgiven. If you win, I'll work it off myself." Keller's eyes gleamed. "You don't have that kind of money." "I have my labor," James said, "and my word, that's worth more than money." Keller studied him, then grinned. "All right, drifter, you got yourself a deal." The cards were dealt. James played carefully, watching Keller's tells, the twitch of his mouth, the way his eyes flickered when he bluffed. The hand came down to the final card. Keller laid down his cards with a smirk, 3 of a kind. James set his cards on the table, straight. The room went silent. Keller's face darkened. You cheated. I didn't, James said calmly. You lost. Keller's hand moved toward his gun. James didn't flinch. You gave your word in front of witnesses. The other men at the table nodded slowly. Keller's jaw clenched. Finally he stood. This isn't over. Yeah, James said quietly, it is. Keller stormed out of the saloon, his men trailing behind him. James sat alone at the table, his heart pounding, his hands steady. He D1. When James returned to the room above the store, Anna was sitting up, cradling baby Clara. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wide with hope and fear. What happened? She asked. James sat down on the edge of the cot. It's done, the debt's gone. Anna's face crumpled. She clutched Clara closer and began to cry deep, shaking sobs of relief. James placed a hand on her shoulder. You're safe now. Anna reached up and took his hand, holding it tightly. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, James said. They sat together in silence, the weight of the past days settling around them like dust after a storm. What will you do now? Anna asked after a while. James looked at her, then at the baby. I was thinking, if you're still planning to go to Santa Fe, I could take you there. Make sure you get to your sister safely. Anna's eyes filled with fresh tears. You'd do that? I would. Anna smiled through her tears. Then I'd like that very much. 2 weeks later, James loaded a small wagon with supplies. Anna was strong enough to travel, and baby Clara had grown plump and healthy. Margaret came to see them off, pressing a bundle of food into Anna's hands. You take care of yourself, Margaret said, and that baby. I will, Anna promised. Thank you for everything. Margaret looked at James. You're a good man, James Coulter. James nodded once, uncomfortable with the praise. They left Redemption at dawn, the wagon creaking along the rutted road as the sun rose behind them. Anna sat beside James, Clara bundled in her arms, watching the town disappear into the distance. Do you think you'll ever stop running? Anna asked quietly. James was silent for a long moment. Then he glanced at her and smiled, small but real. Maybe I already have. Years later, a traveler passing through Santa Fe would hear the story of a man who'd caught a falling woman and delivered her baby before it could hit the ground. The story would be told in taverns and churches, embellished and reshaped with each telling. Some said he was an angel, others said he was just a drifter with a kind heart. The truth was simpler. James Coulter stayed in Santa Fe. He built a small house on the edge of town, worked as a carpenter, and became a fixture in the community. Anna's sister welcomed them both with open arms, and over time, James became part of the family. He never remarried, but he was never alone. Anna and Clara lived in the house next door, and hardly a day passed when James didn't see them. He taught Clara to ride, to read, to recognize the constellations in the night sky. And when she asked about her father, the man she'd never known, Anna would tell her the truth. Your father loved you very much, Anna would say, but the man who saved us both, who gave us a life, that's James. Clara would nod, her eyes solemn and wise beyond her years. And James, listening from the porch, would feel something he thought he'd lost forever. Basil. On his last night, when James was an old man with white hair and hands that trembled in the cold, he sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the distant mountains. Clara, now a woman with children of her own, sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. Do you have any regrets? She asked softly. James thought for a long moment, then he shook his head. No, he said, not a single one. Clara smiled, good. They sat together in silence as the stars began to appear, bright and endless in the darkening sky. And when James closed his eyes for the last time, he saw them again, Clara, Daniel, and Anna, standing together in a field of golden light. They were smiling, waiting. We've been expecting you, Clara said, her voice warm and full of love. James smiled and walked toward them into the light, into the peace he'd finally earned. The house stood empty after that, quiet and still beneath the wide New Mexico sky. But if you passed by on a warm evening, when the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the crickets sang their ancient song, you might hear it. The faint sound of laughter, the cry of a newborn child, the steady, certain voice of a man who'd caught someone when they fell, and in doing so, saved himself. And you would know, without question, that something extraordinary had happened here. Something worth remembering. Forever.